I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it, and I read it to her in there, and I did sort of feel a sort of
innocence about her. You just thought, wow, this girl is...
Few things change a story faster than one unexpected act from someone who has stayed quiet for years. Sometimes a single reaction can send shockwaves through powerful circles, forcing everyone to pay attention. That is exactly what many believe has happened after Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer and brother of Princess Diana, reportedly delivered a response that has people talking across royal circles, Hollywood and beyond. This is one of those moments. Charles Spencer has spent years largely avoiding public battles over his sister's legacy, but when he finally spoke, it wasn't a lengthy speech that grabbed attention. It was a short response that quickly spread through media discussions, reportedly creating concern among those connected to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's public image. Why has it caused such a reaction? Because the criticism, or perceived criticism, did not come from a tabloid, a royal aide, or a long-time opponent. It came from someone whose connection to Diana is unquestionable. To many observers, that gives his words a different weight entirely. The bigger question now is simple. If Diana's own brother is expressing concerns about how her memory is being presented, how will that influence public opinion moving forward? That question sits at the center of a debate that continues to grow. To understand why this matters, you have to understand Charles Spencer himself. Most people know him as the Earl Spencer who occasionally appears at public events, but behind that public image is a man who has spent nearly 3 decades carrying the responsibility of protecting his sister's memory. In 1997, after Diana's tragic death, Spencer stood before a grieving world at Westminster Abbey and delivered one of the most memorable speeches of that era. Rather than simply offering comfort, he spoke passionately about his sister's life and the values he believed mattered most to her. The speech became a defining moment and established him as one of the strongest voices connected to her legacy. Since then, much of that legacy has been centered around Althorp House, the Spencer family estate where Diana spent part of her childhood and where she was ultimately laid to rest. Her resting place remains on private family land, giving Spencer a unique role in preserving how her story is remembered and shared. That position carries enormous responsibility. For years, he largely avoided public disputes, yet many believe something changed as Diana's image became increasingly connected to modern media narratives and commercial projects. Critics often point to what they describe as a growing effort to draw parallels between Diana and Meghan Markle. According to those observers, the comparisons began subtly before becoming much more noticeable over time. Some pointed to the appearance of jewelry once associated with Diana at highly publicized events. Supporters viewed those moments as heartfelt tributes. Critics saw something different. Either way, the comparisons quickly became a part of the public conversation. The discussion expanded far beyond jewelry. When Harry and Meghan sat down for their highly publicized interview with Oprah Winfrey in 2021, many commentators noticed similarities between the themes being discussed and themes that had long been associated with Diana's own struggles within royal life. The interview focused on feelings of isolation, conflict with institutional structures, and public communication outside traditional royal channels. For supporters, those similarities reflected genuine experiences. For critics, they reinforced the growing effort to connect Meghan's story with Diana's, and then came documentaries, streaming projects, interviews, and personal stories. Across much of the content, Diana's presence remained impossible to ignore. Her memory often appeared as an emotional thread connecting past and present. For some viewers, this connection felt natural given Harry's relationship with his mother and the impact her loss had on his life. For others, it increasingly looked like a branding strategy designed to strengthen public interest and emotional engagement. Observers who hold that view argue that Charles Spencer may have become increasingly uncomfortable watching Diana's legacy become linked to commercial entertainment projects. Whether that interpretation is fair or not, it helps explain why his reported reaction generated so much attention. The story becomes even more interesting when viewed. against the backdrop of recent business challenges. By early 2026, public discussion surrounding Harry and Meghan's media ventures had become more intense. Several projects received mixed reactions, and critics questioned whether future productions could recreate the enormous attention that once surrounded the couple. As pressure grew, attention reportedly turned toward a subject that remains one of the most powerful stories in modern royal history: Princess Diana herself. The timing was obvious. The year 2027 marks 3 decades since Diana's death. 30 years later, public fascination remains extraordinary. Her life continues to inspire books, documentaries, articles, and endless debate around the world. From a media perspective, a major documentary centered on Diana would represent a significant opportunity. Industry observers understood that any large-scale project connected to her life would immediately attract global attention. The appeal extended beyond historical storytelling. The proposed angle, according to ongoing speculation and commentary, involved drawing clear parallels between Diana's experiences during the 1990s and Meghan Markle's experiences decades later. That comparison sits at the heart of the controversy. Supporters see it as a legitimate continuation of conversations surrounding public scrutiny, media pressure, and life inside highly visible institutions. Critics see it as an attempt to place 2 very different life stories on the same path, and that is where the debate becomes impossible to separate from Charles Spencer's perspective. If he believes Diana's legacy is being stretched too far or used in ways that do not reflect her story, his reaction carries enormous influence. After all, the proposed narrative depends heavily on presenting Meghan not simply as a member of the royal family, but as the modern continuation of Diana's struggle, the latest woman facing the spotlight, and the next chapter in a story that many believe never truly ended. What looked like a brilliant idea on paper reportedly ran into one massive obstacle almost immediately. The concept was ambitious, emotional, and designed to place Meghan Markle at the center of a major conversation surrounding Princess Diana's legacy. But according to reports and growing speculation, there was one thing the plan absolutely needed to succeed: support from Charles Spencer. When representatives reportedly approached Diana's brother regarding a potential 2027 anniversary project, they were not simply seeking a routine interview or a small contribution. The value of Charles Spencer's involvement would have gone far beyond a brief appearance. His participation would have brought credibility, historical connection, and access to parts of Diana's story that remain largely private to this day. At the center of that interest was Althorp House, the Spencer family estate closely connected to Diana's life and memory. Access to the estate itself would have provided a powerful backdrop for any major documentary project. Beyond that, there was continued public fascination with family archives, personal records, photographs, and other materials that could potentially offer a deeper look into Diana's life beyond the headlines. Just as important was Spencer's personal endorsement. Without it, any documentary could still move forward, but it would lack the approval of one of the people most closely connected to Diana's legacy. With his support, the project would likely have been viewed very differently by audiences around the world. However, according to the narrative that has emerged, Spencer was not persuaded. Reports claim he carefully reviewed the proposal and considered the comparisons being drawn throughout the project. Those comparisons reportedly focused on linking Diana's experiences to Meghan Markle's modern-day story. Then came the response that generated so much attention. According to accounts that circulated widely, Spencer reacted with 4 blunt words. Is this a joke? Whether interpreted as frustration, disbelief, or outright rejection, the message landed hard and immediately changed the conversation surrounding the project. If those reports accurately reflect his position, the significance is obvious. This was not criticism coming from a distant observer or a long-time opponent. It was coming from Diana's brother, a figure many people associate with protecting her memory for nearly 3 decades. What makes the story even more interesting is the growing discussion surrounding Spencer's relationship with Prince William. For years, public attention has focused almost entirely on the tensions between William and Harry, yet some royal observers believe another relationship has quietly strengthened in the background. William and Spencer share something few people can truly understand: Both experienced the loss of Diana from very different perspectives, and both have spent years watching public debates surrounding her memory. Because of that shared connection, commentators often speculate that their views on preserving Diana's legacy may overlap in important ways. Unlike Spencer, William occupies a very different position. As heir to the throne, every public statement carries enormous consequences. Any direct involvement in disputes connected to his brother's media ventures would immediately create headlines across the world. That reality limits what he can publicly say or do. Spencer does not face the same restrictions. As a private citizen, he has greater freedom to express his opinions. That difference creates an interesting dynamic. When criticism comes from palace officials, it can be portrayed as institutional resistance. When concerns come from Diana's brother, many people view them through a completely different lens. That is why some commentators believe Spencer's reported rejection carried so much weight. It shifted the discussion away from palace politics and toward a larger debate about family legacy and personal responsibility. At the center of that debate is a difficult question. When does honoring someone's memory become something else? Where is the line between tribute and commercial use? People have very different answers depending on their perspective. Few people doubt that Prince Harry's connection to his mother remains deeply emotional. Throughout the years, he has spoken openly about the impact her death had on his life. Many observers believe that loss influenced some of the most important decisions he has made, including stepping away from royal duties and building a new life in America. Yet critics argue that genuine love and commercial interests can sometimes exist side by side. In their view, someone may sincerely want to honor a loved one while also participating in projects that generate significant business opportunities. That tension sits at the heart of much of the public debate surrounding Diana's legacy today. For those who believe Spencer opposed the proposal, they see his position as a clear statement that certain boundaries should not be crossed. Whether others agree with that view is another matter entirely, but it helps explain why his reaction attracted such widespread attention. The business implications have also become a major part of the conversation. Industry observers have repeatedly suggested that any large-scale Diana-related documentary would likely attract enormous global interest. Because of that, speculation quickly emerged that such a project could have played an important role in future media plans connected to Harry and Meghan. Media companies operate in a highly competitive environment where audience engagement drives decision-making. Executives ultimately focus on performance, viewership, and long-term value. As a result, the success or failure of major projects often carries consequences that extend well beyond a single production. That reality is why some analysts believe the reported rejection mattered far beyond one documentary idea. If a project loses access to important sources, locations, or key figures connected to its subject matter, the overall perception of that project can change dramatically. The effects may not stop there. Hollywood places enormous value on reputation, credibility, and authenticity. Partnerships are often built on public perception as much as business calculations. For years, Meghan Markle occupied a distinctive place within that world. She represented a connection between modern celebrity culture and one of the most famous families on Earth. That position created opportunities that few public figures could easily replicate, but perception can shift quickly. If influential voices begin questioning the authenticity of a narrative, business partners naturally pay attention. Their concern is rarely about personal loyalties. Instead, it is about public reaction, brand image, and potential controversy. That is why some industry observers believe the larger issue extends far beyond a single documentary proposal. The real concern involves how audiences interpret the story itself. If enough people begin to believe that a beloved public figure's legacy is being used without meaningful support from those closest to that legacy, it creates risks that many companies would rather avoid. In a media environment increasingly focused on authenticity, trust, and public accountability, those questions become difficult to ignore and potentially dangerous for anyone connected to the narrative. The story is already showing clear signs of cooling down, and the momentum that once surrounded American Riviera Orchard is slipping in a way that's hard to ignore. The fashion deals that were once talked about as guaranteed big wins haven't landed at the level people expected, and those A-list social invitations that were supposed to keep things buzzing seem to be showing up less and less frequently now. Nothing here is a total disaster on its own, but when you stack all these signals together, it starts to look like a brand slowly losing altitude in real time, and the Spencer veto becomes the moment that hits the brakes even harder on that descent. There is also a deeper human layer to this entire situation that goes far beyond branding, media deals, or public perception, and it cuts into something far more personal and emotional that many people overlook. Charles Spencer has been carrying a very specific kind of guilt for nearly 30 years now, a burden that is rarely spoken about openly, but is deeply tied to who he is and why he reacts so strongly when it comes to his sister's legacy and memory. It was Charles Spencer who introduced Princess Diana to the journalist behind the infamous 1995 Panorama interview, a moment that would later be surrounded by heavy controversy involving unethical tactics, forged documents, and emotional manipulation that changed everything forever. Diana was vulnerable at that time, emotionally overwhelmed, and searching for a way to express her truth to the world. But that vulnerability was turned into something far more damaging than anyone could have fully understood at the time. Charles Spencer witnessed the aftermath of that situation unfold, and when the deeper details about how the interview was obtained later came to light, the emotional weight of it reportedly hit him with devastating force. The idea that he may have unintentionally contributed to one of the most painful public exposures of his sister's life has stayed with him for decades, shaping how he views media, storytelling, and the protection of personal narratives. From that point onward, everything he has done has carried a protective instinct, almost like a shield placed over Diana's memory, to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself in any similar form again. Now, when he looks at the modern Sussex media ecosystem, he doesn't just see celebrity content or documentary production at work. He sees something far more familiar and unsettling. He sees emotional storytelling being packaged, refined, and distributed at scale, where deeply personal experiences are turned into global media products that generate attention, engagement, and profit. To him, it can look like a pattern he has already lived through once before, where vulnerability becomes narrative fuel and where pain, grief, and identity are transformed into tools of mass consumption under a polished media strategy. He sees echoes of emotional framing, structured storytelling, and carefully shaped public perception, all wrapped around themes of struggle, identity, and legacy. For Charles Spencer, this is not theoretical at all. It is visceral, personal, and rooted in lived experience. He has already seen how quickly narratives can spiral when emotion and media power collide, and that is why his reaction carries so much weight when he chooses to intervene or refuse access to sensitive family archives. And this is where Prince Harry becomes central to the emotional tension of the entire situation, even if he is not always positioned that way in public coverage. Harry has often been portrayed as someone slightly carried along by the larger media narrative surrounding him, especially in relation to his wife's public and professional ambitions. His connection to the Spencer family has always been one of the most emotionally grounded parts of his life. The Spencers represented something very different from the formal structure of royal life. They represented warmth, openness, and emotional directness that contrasted sharply with the rigidity of palace expectations. When Princess Diana was alive, she acted as the bridge between those two worlds, connecting the strict formality of the royal institution with the more emotionally expressive Spencer environment. After her passing, that bridge didn't disappear entirely because Charles Spencer stepped in and maintained that connection for her sons in his own way. He stood at Westminster Abbey during her funeral and made a promise to protect them, and that promise became symbolic of a long-term emotional responsibility he carried quietly but firmly through the years. So when tensions emerge today between Harry and his uncle, especially in a way that results in public distance or rejection, it doesn't just register as a professional disagreement, it feels like a rupture in something much older and more foundational. The emotional weight becomes even heavier when you consider the internal questions Harry may now be forced to confront in private moments, especially while living far from the UK in Montecito. Questions like, at what point did honouring my mother become building a brand? At what point did I stop being Diana's son and start being a Netflix executive's asset? And is there any road back from where I am now to the place where my uncle can look at me without contempt? These questions are not simple reflections. They represent an identity conflict that blends family legacy, public perception, and personal meaning in a way that is extremely difficult to untangle. At the center of this entire situation is also a critical piece that many observers believe carries enormous weight: the archival material held at Althorpe. The so-called secret weapon of the 2027 documentary project wasn't just standard royal footage or public appearances, because those have already been seen countless times across decades of documentaries and retrospectives. The real value was in something much more intimate and unreleased. We are talking about personal diaries written in Princess Diana's own handwriting, home video recordings that have never been digitized or broadcast, and private material that has remained entirely within the Spencer family's control. This is the version of Diana that exists outside of public image and carefully curated media history. The private thoughts, emotional reflections, fears, hopes, and internal struggles that were never meant for public consumption. For any production team, gaining access to that material would completely transform the documentary landscape, because audiences today are no longer impressed by recycled footage or well-known interviews. They want something new, something raw, something never before seen. Without that access, the entire commercial and creative promise of the project changes dramatically, because the emotional newness disappears. And by refusing access to those archives, Charles Spencer has effectively made a deliberate choice that shifts the direction of the narrative entirely. It can be interpreted not just as refusal, but as protection. A decision to preserve privacy in an era where almost everything eventually becomes content. In a world where personal history is constantly mined for entertainment value, sealing those archives ensures that Diana's private self remains untouched by modern media extraction. That decision carries emotional weight, but also a form of strategic clarity, because as long as those materials remain private, the most powerful version of Diana remains defined by memory, family knowledge, and lived experience rather than by production companies or streaming platforms. At this point, the bigger existential question surrounding the Sussex brand becomes unavoidable. It is no longer just about growth, expansion, or content strategy. It has shifted into something more fundamental and more uncomfortable. Who are Meghan and Harry without Diana? That question cuts to the core of their entire media identity, because so much of the emotional resonance surrounding their public story has historically been tied to Princess Diana's legacy, memory, and symbolic weight. Without that connection acting as emotional architecture, the content they produce faces a very different kind of scrutiny. Projects like Archetypes, the Spotify podcast, were widely described as thoughtful and polished, but not necessarily essential. Listening in a crowded media space where attention is limited and competition is intense. The Netflix cooking-related content was warm and visually appealing, but it didn't create the kind of cultural moment that dominates conversation beyond its immediate audience. Even the Polo documentary delivered decent viewing numbers, but it didn't generate sustained global discussion or long-term cultural impact after its release period ended. Each of these projects shares a structural reality. They rely heavily on the existing fame of the individuals involved, rather than on a deeply compelling standalone narrative that extends beyond celebrity interest. And that is where the hidden damage of the Althorpe decision becomes more visible. It doesn't just block one production, it exposes a deeper vulnerability in the overall storytelling foundation. The emotional gravity that once surrounded the Sussex narrative was significantly amplified by its connection to Princess Diana's legacy. She represented not just history, but emotional stakes that elevated everything connected to her sons into something larger than standard celebrity storytelling. Without that emotional anchor, the narrative shifts. It becomes the story of two globally recognized public figures navigating fame, identity, and media pressure, but without the mythic or historical weight that once made every chapter feel world-shaping. That shift changes audience perception in a very real way, because emotional investment in media is often driven by perceived stakes, legacy, and historical depth. And Diana provided all three in a way that very few figures in modern public life ever have. So when Charles Spencer blocks access, it is not simply a production setback. It becomes a symbolic boundary being drawn, a line that signals where storytelling ends and personal legacy begins. His response, summed up in the now widely discussed phrase, "Is this a joke?" carries emotional force precisely because it reflects not just disagreement, but disbelief and rejection of the framing being proposed. He is positioned as someone defending not just memory, but meaning itself. From his perspective, the comparison between Princess Diana's lived experience and modern media storytelling can feel fundamentally incompatible, especially when commercial branding enters the equation. That is why his stance carries such emotional authority, because it is rooted in proximity to the real person behind the global icon. For Prince Harry, the consequences of this moment are deeply personal in ways that extend far beyond media or business concerns. There is an emotional separation taking shape between him and the family network that once formed a core part of his identity after Diana's death. That kind of distance is not easily measured in contracts or projects. It is measured in trust, connection, and shared history. For Meghan, the situation also carries emotional complexity, even as it unfolds in a public-facing professional environment. She entered the royal space as an outsider and has since been associated with one of the most recognizable royal narratives in modern history. Her public image has often been connected, fairly or unfairly, to interpretations of Princess Diana's story, creating a symbolic overlap that continues to shape public perception. And now, with access to certain historical materials potentially restricted, that symbolic connection becomes more fragile and contested. So the question that remains at the center of everything is simple, but extremely heavy. Can the Sussex brand survive the loss of Diana as its emotional foundation? Because what has shifted is not just access to archives or cooperation from a family member, it is the stability of the narrative structure that once supported the entire public identity of their story. Without that foundation, the emotional intensity that once surrounded their work becomes harder to sustain at the same level. Charles Spencer's decision therefore represents more than a refusal. It represents a redefinition of boundaries around legacy, memory, and storytelling control. And as this situation continues to evolve, the implications ripple outward into identity, media strategy, and public perception in ways that are still unfolding. The estate at Althorpe remains quiet, and the materials remain sealed away from public consumption. The private recordings and handwritten pages stay untouched, preserved in their original form, away from external interpretation. And in that silence, Diana's personal world remains protected from becoming something entirely shaped by modern media production. Prince Harry is left facing the emotional and strategic aftermath of that decision, and the implications are still settling in. The promise made years ago still echoes in the background of everything unfolding now, shaping perception and response. And that is why this moment carries so much weight. It's not just about media access, it's about memory, loyalty, identity, and legacy colliding all at once. So the conversation now turns outward into public interpretation and reaction, where every detail is analysed and debated. Do you believe the Diana narrative is now permanently off the table for the Sussexes? Is there any version of recovery from this kind of rupture? And what does it mean for a media identity built so heavily around legacy and memory? Leave your thoughts below and stay connected as this story continues to evolve. Comment and subscribe.